And it's wonderful to see everyone. Again, I'm Rabbi Shankman. I am thrilled to welcome you to our Women of Washington Hebrew. Oh, hold on a second. To our Women of Washington Hebrew Literary Club for this month, and am also thrilled to welcome our author today, and to welcome Emily Franklin. And as we get started, I want to share a couple of things. I don't know if you can see this in the chat or if I have to add it again. We hope that you've already read the book, and if you haven't, it's fine, because you'll be intrigued and excited and inspired to read it. And then I encourage you to go to a local bookstore like Politics and Prose, or other bookstores in the area. One of my personal favorites is Curious Iguana up in Frederick, but there are many others. And so we encourage you to go to a local bookstore. And we also know that we have an option of purchasing it through our Mitzvah Mall, which also will support some of our social justice activities, such as what we just did before Thanksgiving, our Sunday stuffing. So there's a link for that as well. But again, always support your local booksellers. And we want to thank the Jewish Book Council, who made this possible, and who were our link to finding Emily and introducing us to her current book, The Lioness of Boston, which you can see mirrored behind her.
Right.
I love that backdrop. And I want to thank Mara Brick and Bonnie Youngentab, as always, for being partners, wonderful partners in the process of selecting books, selecting authors. It's both about the book, but really it's more about the author, because often we haven't read the book by the time we meet the author. And we were really excited to welcome and to bring Emily Franklin to be with all of us for this Women of Washington Hebrew Congregation Literary Club. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Emily, and then I'm going to turn it over to her to start. Emily Franklin is the author of more than 20 novels and a poetry collection, Tell Me How You Got Here. Her award-winning work has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Guernica, JAMA, and numerous literary magazines, as well as long-listed for the London Sunday Times Short Story Award, featured and read aloud on NPR, and named notable by the Association of Jewish Libraries. She lives outside Boston, or in Boston, in Newton, Mass, with her family, 4 children, and 2 large dogs, supposedly large enough to be lions, which particularly resonates with this book. And I'm sure she'll tell us a little bit more about well, maybe not about the dogs, but the inspiration for writing this book. So Emily, we'd love to start by having you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book, what inspired you, and we'll take it from there.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I can sort of read a little bit about sort of I was going to talk a little bit about myself and then go into the inspiration for this novel, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
Great. And then obviously there's lots of time for questions afterwards. And
I just a reminder to folks who are on here, you can feel free to send me questions through the chat. You can send them directly to me so that they're not distracting as Emily's speaking and then as she's doing her reading. Or when we get to questions, we'll have an opportunity for you to share those in the chat as well. Thank you.
So I thought I would talk for, a few minutes, if that's okay, and then we'll open it up. But thank you so much for hosting me. I'm really grateful to be here. And I'm grateful that all of you are here in support of the written word and in support of books, since we are the people of the book. I want to tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll tell you more about my book and how I got my idea and my research. And obviously then I'll take questions, or we can interact however you usually do it in this forum. And you can ask me about the Lioness of Boston, or about me, or my writing process. So I'm here to talk about The Lioness of Boston, which for people who haven't read it is historical fiction based on the life of trailblazer Isabella Stewart Gardner. And I definitely want to share this fascinating woman with you, but I want to share a little bit about myself first so you maybe have more context. I write in many different genres, including adult fiction, nonfiction, young adult fiction, memoir. I had a cookbook. I have essays like my book, How to Spell Hanukkah, 18 Writers Celebrate 8 Nights of Lights, and my poetry collection, which was called Tell Me How You Got Here. And that was published in 2021. Poetry was actually my first love, and my first publications were all the way back in high school. I write a lot about family and food and loss and the natural world, a lot of math and science in there. One of the poems in the poetry collection is called How the Jews Say Goodbye, and maybe this will resonate with some of you, but as the title suggests, the poem really details how we all take forever to say goodbye. This just happened at the high holidays. I suspect it will happen again at the Hanukkah party I'm hosting in a couple of weeks, but I hosted 25 people for Rosh Hashanah. And, you do your rounds of goodbye to this friend and that cousin and this neighbor and my mother-in-law. And then when you have your coat on and you've got your leftovers in your hands, now is the time that you're finally having that deep conversation with Aunt Barbara, or finally getting to talk to David, and you stand in the doorway talking for so long, but then you have to go and say another round of goodbyes all over again. Anyway, that's what that particular poem is about. And I think one of the things that I really love about poetry is that it conveys these very big, familiar feelings in the shortest amount of space possible. And choosing just the right word or description for poetry really helps with my fiction writing, and it certainly helped with The Lioness of Boston. Anyway, so back to me. After college, I took a job as a cook on historic schooners and yachts off the coast of Maine. And in the off seasons, I cobbled together a life. I taught high school, I worked in construction, I wrote medical articles, and then I began doing a bunch of freelance writing. All along, I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't quite sure how to make that happen. But all of my job experience, particularly on the boat, proved incredibly important, both in terms of the breadth of experience I had to write about and the particular skills that I gained. For example, when I was cooking for crowds of 50 people on a diesel stove and on open water, I learned more about time management than I might have done in a classroom or a typical office job. And of course, this really helped because, as you heard, I host big holiday meals and I love cooking for everyone, and wound up writing a cookbook memoir based on my experience cooking. And it also helped with balancing having 4 children with no childcare and writing more than 24 books. So now I teach mainly at conferences and write and visit schools, and I write freelance articles sometimes, but most of the time I write novels, and I just finished my next poetry collection. I grew up part in Boston and part in London, and both of those places really helped me in writing The Lioness of Boston. The settings, the characters, even though they're from the 1800s, the cadence and the dialogue all came very naturally for me. And like Isabella Stewart Gardner, who I'm going to tell you about more soon in case you haven't read the book, I did feel very much like an outsider. Growing up, I often felt that I was straddling not only 2 countries, but also the WHC Boston society where I went to prep school and the British class system where I lived. And my own Jewish roots put me at odds with both of those groups. I was always myself, even when I experienced anti-Semitic remarks or bullying. But people often assumed I wasn't Jewish, which made me feel even more like an outsider. And sometimes even in Jewish groups, I've also had to feel a little bit like an outsider. I'm often asked if I converted, no, or if I'm only part Jewish, also no. And as an adult, I've really embraced all of my history: London, Boston, my Judaism. My husband and I wrote our own family Haggadah with prayers and songs and poems, and actually includes some humorous haikus we got from everybody to write. Everybody in the family got to submit their entries. Anyway, so writers are always studying other people. And in some ways, being an outsider to all of these groups helped me hone my observational skills, which strengthens my work. And as you heard from Sue, I live outside of Boston with my husband and 4 kids, although they're really young adults now. And so they're not all living at home, and we gather for holidays. And I really treasure having big dinners and including everyone, no matter what their background, which I guess I share with Isabella Stewart Gardner, who often did the same. And we share the importance of freedom, or the sweet New Year, or Thanksgiving, or now we're getting ready for Hanukkah with about 1,000 latkes and sufganiyot, which I make. My husband's a pediatrician, and I ask him to bring home the biggest syringe that he has, and I just suck up all the jelly that I make from scratch from my dairies, and I inject the donuts. It's very satisfying. My grandparents taught me that no matter the actual size of your table, space at the dining table is infinite. And that is something that I hope I'm passing on to my children. And while I used to squeeze in writing during nap time or while nursing, I now have much more time, but I really miss those little babies and toddlers. So now you know more about my background, and I will tell you more about the novel that brought us together today, The Lioness of Boston. I know because of this format, I can't sort of ask how many of you have ever been to the museum, but some of you might have visited the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
If people can maybe do a, I don't know if you go to reactions, you could get a hand raise from people. I think.
I've never been.
If you've been.
Do you want to hold up your hand? Okay, so Ellen has been. I can see that Ellen has been. All right. Well, for those of you who are not familiar, this is a stunning Venetian style palace right in the heart of Boston. And it is inspired by Venice, but it actually has a lot of Islamic art influences also, some of the curvature and the pillars. And when I first visited the museum as a child, I thought the place was magic. I just marveled at the museum's interior courtyard. It had bright orchids and clusters of calla lilies. And if you haven't been there, so you have this mansion museum right in the heart of downtown Boston. And it's really feels like she has brought the outside into the inside of a building. And, it was the first time for me as a kid that the boundaries between outside world and inside world seemed to disappear. And Isabella Stewart Gardner really was the kind of person who wanted those boundaries between places, between people, between classes to fade away. She really wanted to connect. And so I wandered those vast rooms. I often would go with my dad. It was sort of our special place that we would go. And I noticed even that first time that I was with him as he held my hand, that the museum has not only this astonishing array of masterworks of art, Botticelli and John Singer Sargent, Degas, but also antique chairs. I mean, actually, if you haven't been there, I suggest that you go because it's a great trip and it's a stunning place. But when you're there, you should really take notice of how many chairs she has there. I think she had a chair problem. She really collected so many chairs. But some of the chairs are Duncan Phyfe chairs. These are like priceless chairs, and some of them are just simple metal garden chairs. And there are vases and rare books and tapestries and writing desks and these very beautiful glass perfume vials that are double-sided. There are fire andirons that are, as tall as I am. They're ornate tiles, and there's even a lock of Robert Browning's hair. And so really what was exciting to me as I explored that very first time was the idea that this museum was different. And its collection suggested that anything could be art. And that was a complete reframe for my young mind. And then in March of 1990, I was a senior in high school, and we took a field trip with my art history class to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And I sat in that very cavernous Dutch room, and the artwork really drew me in. And I wrote a paper about Rembrandt's Storm in the Sea of Galilee and Vermeer's The Concert. And 10 days later, those paintings were cut from their frames, stolen in one of the largest art heists in history. And even today, those frames remain empty. If you look online, you'll be able to Google search an image and pull up a photograph of these empty golden frames. And it's a marker of hope for their safe return, but it's also because Isabella Stewart Gardner made sure nothing in her museum could ever be moved and nothing could ever be changed. And there's a lot of focus now on this infamous art heist at the Gardner Museum. But at the time, I was really fascinated with the woman who built the museum. You know, in the Lioness of Boston, Isabella says, we are all born at the wrong time. And I think this is certainly how she felt, at least at the beginning. She really was ahead of her time. She was forward thinking and in many ways initially misunderstood. And obviously, eventually she becomes this Boston celebrity before celebrity culture even exists. A lot of Bostonians know more about the artwork housed at the museum than who Isabella Stewart Gardner was and how she came to be the first woman to open up a museum in the United States and paved the way for people like Peggy Guggenheim. You know, as a side note, I've been touring for this novel since April, and at almost every event, I'm asked if I personally know where the stolen artwork is. And it just makes me laugh because I don't know. I don't know why people would think that I would know, but it's very sweet. But there's also a $10 million reward. So I think if I did know, I'd probably be chasing that down. But so anyway, so Boston at the time of the heist was really focused on the artwork, this priceless artwork that was stolen. But I was really focused on the empty frames, you know, because Isabella Stewart Gardner's directive stated that nothing can ever be moved or changed and nothing can ever be added to the collection. And actually, if anything is changed, the land that the museum sits on, the contents, and the museum itself goes to Harvard. So those empty frames are still there. So, you know, it really struck me that if another museum, you know, the National Gallery or the Museum of Fine Arts has something stolen, the case that it was in, you know, is removed. And over a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you sort of forget what happened. But because of Isabella's directive, we can't forget what had been there, and we can't forget the loss or damage. And so it's those frames that really stuck with me long after the news about the heist went away. And this was well before the Netflix series that's there. And as a writer, I was really struck with this great metaphor. I think that we all have losses, those sort of metaphorical frames that we carry with us, these empty frames. And sometimes we show them to people and sometimes we don't have them on display, but those frames are always there. And so I kept those frames in my mind as time went by. And so time did go by, as it always does. I got married and I had many children and I wrote many books. And I was actually researching a totally different novel when I rekindled my fascination with Isabella Stewart Gardner. And I realized while I was at the museum researching that novel that I didn't end up publishing, people knew more about the museum than about the woman who built it. And so I would come home to these family dinners from my days at the museum and tell my husband and kids at the dinner table about what an amazing life Isabella Stewart Gardner lived and how, you know, she just went everywhere. She camped in the Middle East. She was friends with Henry James and John Singer Sargent. And she was this woman who went to all male lectures at Harvard and sort of infiltrated this male dominated world. And I said, you know, her life would just make an incredible novel. Somebody should really write that. And my husband would just sort of look at me and be like, maybe you'll meet somebody who could do that. And so I took that as my cue that I should write that book, which I ended up doing. You know, French author Guy de Maupassant wrote that our memory is a more perfect world than the universe. It gives back life to those who no longer exist. Excuse me. Memory is a crucial part of writing for me, and memory is obviously a crucial part of being Jewish. And as a writer, I've always been fascinated with memory. I think it's one way that we ascribe meaning to people and to events is to remember them. And in writing The Lioness of Boston, this theme of memory and meaning was there right at the beginning. When I first started researching Isabella Stewart Gardner and her sort of nothing can ever be changed directive, I was really curious about the kind of person who decides this, all right? Somebody who's determined to keep everything as it was is determined both to have their vision shared with others and also in some way, you know, to be remembered and to be remembered specifically in the way that they arranged. And art is another way to be remembered or to fix a particular moment in time. And I believe that for Isabella Stewart Gardner, art and objects were also a way of storytelling. So this mansion museum is filled with objects that speak to this theme of memory and what we keep. And each object or piece of art that she collected tells the story of how and where, and in my novel, why she might have added this particular object or piece of art to her collection. The novel begins in 1861 when Isabella Stewart has married Boston Brahmin Jack Gardner, and she moves to Boston, having completed finishing school in Paris. And she moves with very high hopes, but those hopes are dashed when Boston society rejects Isabella for a number of different reasons, including the fact that she had lots of opinions and wasn't shy about expressing them, which is very frowned upon for a woman. And following on the heels of her societal rejection, Isabella has personal tragedies and some losses. And even though the novel is thoroughly researched and historically accurate, I don't like to give away spoilers in case everybody in this group hasn't read the novel yet. So I'll just say that there are tragedies and issues that Isabella has to work through. And following the tragedies, Isabella actually sank into quite a deep depression. This is true and accurate. On the advice of the family physician, her husband Jack arranged to take her to Europe. And it is there that Isabella really begins to tap back into her outspoken nature, her intellectual curiosity, her personal curiosity, which has always connected her to others. And this sends her on a life trajectory that includes this infiltration of the all-male Harvard world after she meets Charles Eliot Norton, who's the first professor of
Somebody's calling you.
She meets Charles Eliot Norton, who's the first professor of art history. He's the person who connects her to Jewish immigrant Harvard student Bernard Berenson. Some of you may have read The Personal Librarian. Bernard Berenson is in that. But Bernard Berenson is really Isabella's lifelong friend and lifelong art advisor. And he goes on, obviously, to become one of the most famous art historians in the world and stays her art advisor until the end of her days. One of the things that was fascinating for me to realize as I was writing the novel was that the same qualities that caused Isabella to be rejected in the first place, her curiosity, her strength, her outspoken nature, her natural fire that she had that connected her to the world, those are the same qualities that saved her from her depression following her tragedies. And her incredible journey of transformation is paralleled with Boston's transformation in the novel. I really loved all of the research that was required for the Lioness of Boston. I was a very bookish kid and I enjoyed learning about everything. I was curious about people and places and history and science and medicine. As a child, my brothers always wanted to sit at the kid table or the cooler teenage table. And I always asked to sit at the grandparent table. I really wanted to know about life before I was born and the details from other people's lives, which make me better understand their experiences. So this is not only helpful in my writing life, but it's helpful to me in my personal life. My grandparents also taught me that curiosity is the basis for empathy. And we certainly need more of that now. And I think when we're really, truly curious about other people, we feel for them without judgment. And I believe that this was also true for Isabella Stewart Gardner. So with this research, I started by making a timeline of Isabella Stewart Gardner's life, which is actually a feat in and of itself because Isabella and her sisters-in-law all had children, and they were all named John, Jack, or Joe. And they were all born in a short time period. And so it was very complicated at the beginning. But once I had all of the names straightened out, I would add extra layers. And so I would, I build in all these different layers. I research everything that I might want to include around Isabella's life. I knew I wanted to stay true to the backbone of her life, but I wanted to know what was happening in Europe. This was in art and in politics. And even if the Franco-Prussian War didn't directly influence her life, I needed to know what was happening with it. And I needed to know what was happening in Boston. When was the Boston Public Garden built? And when did they add the wrought iron fence? What about the swan boats? And what about Harvard? And what about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whom she did meet? And whether or not Isabella Stewart Gardner personally interacted with all of the historical events or people, I still, as a writer, needed to know that I was informed. So I needed to know if Frederick Douglass was speaking in New Bedford, even though Isabella Stewart Gardner didn't directly interact with him. She did go to New Bedford, and that was actually the wealthiest city in America at that time. In The Lioness of Boston, I highlight the ways in which Isabella Stewart Gardner was ahead of her time and frankly misunderstood. So I researched other strong women at that time, and then I had Isabella interact with them. So much of the novel is based on real events in her life, real things that happened. She really did become very close friends with Henry James and John Singer Sargent and Julia Ward Howe, who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic. And she really did become this celebrity before celebrity culture. But there were a few instances in the novel where I either pushed at the truth or overlapped truth and fiction. And a good example of this would be the research that I did about art, which led me to decide to have a chapter in which Isabella goes to the first Impressionist exhibit in Paris. So the exhibit unfolds in the Lioness of Boston the way it did in real life. It took place at photographer Nadar's studio in 1874, and everyone was there. Monet, Manet, Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, Pissarro, and Bertha Morisot. I mean, this really happened. They weren't even known as the Impressionists yet. They were just a group of artists called the Anonymous Society. But Isabella Stewart Gardner didn't really attend that exhibit. She was in Paris, and she could have gone. So I'm asked, why did I choose to have her go? And my answer is this: because of every artist I named, Monet, Manet, Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, Pissarro, and Morisot, it's Morisot's we know the least about. And that has been my experience on this book tour. And the only reason we don't know as much about her and we can't immediately picture her work is because she was a woman. And so when I was writing a novel about art and collecting and the first woman to open a museum in the United States, I had a choice. And the choice I made was to have Isabella go to the exhibit because, first of all, it's fascinating to have all those incredible artists in one place. And also because she needs to start questioning her role in the world, her role in artistic life, and the roles of women in general. So we know that Isabella Stewart Gardner was this formidable, slightly outrageous, ahead of her time woman. But in the novel, we need to imagine or reimagine the way that she would get there. She didn't always start off like that. And I wanted to have Pissarro in there. He's the only Jewish artist in the painting group. Isabella and Pissarro have an exchange that I'm going to read when she's asked him about changing his name. "We've found a group here," Pissarro paused. "Non-traditional, but a group nonetheless. We haven't a fixed name as of yet. And as to your earlier comment, I dropped the names Jacob and Abraham for reasons I'm sure a woman of your intellect can understand." Pissarro's eyes lowered to meet mine. "I want them to see the art, not the Jew." I reached for his arm before he could turn away. "Are they not the same?" I asked. Pissarro focused his gaze on me. "Mrs. Jack, you really do see more than the average human. I do hope you put the sight to good use one day." So that was just a little bit of the novel. Each detail I put into these chapters and each scene and each line is a choice. And it has to add not only to the plot and to the reader's understanding of history, but to Isabella's journey. The great blessing of Isabella Stewart Gardner is that, excuse me 1 second. Again, I apologize. I'm getting over this cold and it's catching up with me. The great blessing of Isabella Stewart Gardner is that while she left an enormous Venetian-style mansion museum filled with her objects, and each of them tells a story, she really didn't leave much of her personal writing. And this was great for me. It afforded me, as a novelist, great gaps in storytelling. So we have her letters that she exchanged with Henry James, and her letters that she exchanged with Bernard Berenson. The letters that are in my book are fabricated. There's a careful blend of history that I tried for, which is you have the opening of the Boston Swan boats, for example, very much to the date and the description, which was real. And then you have Isabella, for example, cutting to the front of the line, which was not real, but it could have happened. It's illustrating a point about her and about the friends she'd made up until that point, the head gardener at the Boston Public Garden, for example. I tend to research in this sort of 360 kind of way, which is to say I read everything I can about the people in my novel and about art and about other people alive at the time, as well as scientific inventions, opera performances, the kinds of streetlights they had in Boston in 1861, who exhibited at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It's also where the zipper was introduced, in case you care about that. But it's the World's Fair is where she meets Anders Zorn, who did one of her very famous portraits. I researched gardening pamphlets and anything else I could get my hands on that would really make it so that you would feel that as a reader that you were in these scenes with her. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum itself has very detailed records of the provenance of many of her objects and art. And when I would come across an object that had no details of its acquisition, an unknown provenance, that afforded me the space to create whole scenes around when or how she might have acquired such a piece of art. So as I mentioned, I write in different genres, and certainly the poetry really helped tremendously with the cadence and word choice and rhythm. And The Lioness of Boston was my first historic novel, but I'm definitely at home in the historic world. My hope is that readers will really experience The Lioness of Boston and come to understand that this is a story of reinvention. After rejection and personal tragedy, Isabella really could have cloistered herself away in her Boston home, but instead she explored the greater world. She found her place with society, found her place with people who society overlooked. Those were really her people. And she collected art with a very specific mission. She collected art to make it accessible to the public. So The Lioness of Boston is not only a historic fiction, but it's this novel that's focused on a powerful, independent woman who defied societal expectations. I want to leave you, I mean, I'm going to be here for questions, but I'll leave you just with this quotation from E.L. Doctorow that I love. The historian will tell you what happened. The novelist will tell you what it felt like. I'm just grateful to you all for being here. And I'll just share with you that if your name is Isabella, or you know anybody in your life who's Isabella, you have free lifetime admission to the museum.
So I had seen that in the reading of the book. My daughter's name is Isabel. Is it only
that
Isabella?
counts. Yep, that counts.
Ah, I don't know if she knew that when she went, because she went with my husband when they went most recently. But I love that. Thank you. Really, it was and thank you for those words by E.L. Doctorow, whose sister was a teacher. My mom, who is on here, Phil Shankman, with her, and it's a really nice connection. I love his work as well. But so apt, obviously, to really what you've done with this book, both the history and the feeling. And if you have not read it, please, the link is in the chat to Amazon, but also, as mentioned, please support your local booksellers, and you can put yourself inside Isabella Stewart Gardner's shoes and imagine what it must have felt like, certainly when she came to Boston, and as she just was on this lifelong journey of discovery, as we all are, and finding her voice and finding her place and her purpose. So thank you. Thank you. I'm
actually going to be in your neck of the woods next week.
Yes, I know. We have another literary club next week that had already been scheduled. When we rescheduled this, we wanted to maximize our participation at this session. But where are you going to be?
The Women's Club of Chevy Chase has that's open to the public. It's a lunch, and Politics and Prose is actually going to be there selling the books and stuff. So I'll be able to find books in person.
Oh, so we can bring our books in
That's
person.
True. Yeah, you can.
You and I can email, and I can share that information out. I also know Emily had offered, I think, as well, to sign book plates potentially if people want
I'm happy to personalize anything, especially with Hanukkah coming up. It's good.
So we can arrange that. So I have a few questions here for you. And also, as a follow-up, which we can talk about offline, I would love to talk to you about the Haggadah that you and your husband did, because my husband and I we create a Haggadah every year after finding that we're always using multiple and going between multiple Haggadah. So that's a conversation for another time. Sure. But I know you spent significant time at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. How much time during the writing of this book and in preparation for writing it, how much additional time, and how much of that time was in sort of the I don't want, not the files, but what they have in terms of their her papers, etc., and how much just wandering the museum?
It's sort of both. I mean, the archivist there is very helpful, so I could ask very specific questions, but so much of it, especially for people who haven't been to the museum, just a very different kind of experience. It's very different to regular museums. I suppose it's overlaps, you know, with places like the Barnes Collection or the Frick and other sort of house museums, but there's so much that I got out of just wandering around and trying to put myself in her headspace and picture her having people over just to have tea in front of this giant cavernous, you know, fireplace and things like that. And so that was very useful for the feelings and for scene setting, but then for the details and for learning about how she acquired different paintings and sort of more of the history of her life, I did have to rely on more archival stuff.
Did you happen to talk to any, are there family members who are
Well, it's funny. So I know that there are family members. I'm not in touch with them, except that I don't often travel for research purposes, but I did go in the end of 2019. This was like just the last trip before COVID. I went, I wanted, Isabella Stewart Gardner camped in the Middle East. And I thought, well, if she camped in the Middle East, I should camp in the Middle East. My husband was thrilled. But she probably camped in what is now Saudi Arabia. So obviously I was not going to do that, but I had researched Oman, and I got another writer friend to come with me, and I invited a friend who she didn't know, and she invited another friend who I didn't know, and we all went to this trip to Oman where I had arranged for us to camp in the desert. There were camels, we were camping, it was very exciting. And the friend that she brought with her was Elizabeth Gardner.
Wow.
It was so strange. I didn't even know this going into it, but yeah, she's not an
Did
original.
you already have plans to write the book?
Oh yeah, it was already almost done. I just
Okay.
I needed to write this desert scene. And so yeah, Liz Gardner was there, and she married Gus Gardner, who is the great grandson or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. So have you heard from any of the family members since writing the book?
I just got an email from one of them who works at the Met in New York, at the Metropolitan Museum there, and he loved it, and he was so excited, and he was going up to Maine to their family, you know, estate there, and was going to share it with other family members, and that was really nice. But you know, I'm experiencing a little bit of the sort of Isabella Stewart Gardner rejection situation, which is the novel is doing incredibly well because I've had such great support from book groups and things like that, and it's in its fourth printing. But the museum has chosen not to carry it and does not want to support the novel because they feel that if people buy the novel, they won't buy the biography that they published of her. I was saying we could have more of a dialogue about it, but
well, research shows that when you have, it's sort of, we all know here we have an REI across the street from an LLB, and then both thriving, and
exactly.
often you have
I don't see it as an either or. I see it as a both and. But
yeah, exactly. Someone who likes one is more likely to purchase the other. And you touched on this a little bit, you know, just now, and thinking about sort of her experience coming from New York, and thinking about the elite families of New York and the elite families of Boston. What were some of the differences at that time? I mean, she certainly struggled when she came to Boston.
She did. I mean, I think part of it was this outsider. She's not a Boston person, but I'm not even sure. So she's from New York. Her parents were Scottish and made their money largely by importing Irish linen. But she went to finishing school in Paris. And so she was there from the time she was sort of 15, 16. So she was really not even in New York that long. I think New York was more welcoming of newer money and difference in general. Boston was much more puritanical and a closed society. And so I think, you know, her outspoken nature was really just frowned upon. And I also know that, you know, she took she's an outsider taking a very eligible Boston Brahmin boy off the market. And that was not received well. And I think, honestly, she also had some social missteps when she came to Boston. She met Jack because she was friends with his sister, Julia. They had met at finishing school in Paris. And so Julia says, come visit me in Paris. Isabella comes and she meets Jack and they hit it off. But at things like there was a big ball in Boston and Isabella said yes yes, she would have a dance with the prince. The prince says, would you dance with me? She said, yes, I will. Not realizing that that was a dance that had been promised to one of the Brahmin family's daughters. And so she didn't really understand that Boston would hold on to that memory for such a long time. Isabella really didn't get the social game and all of the gamesmanship that was about society.
Wow. I know you mentioned that you're working on a book of poetry, and you had mentioned this was your first historical fiction. I'm curious, what is your favorite genre, and what do you think your next? Do you have it? Do you have more historical
I'm well
fiction in
into the
works?
next book. So yes, the second poetry collection is finished, but the next novel, I'm well into the writing and research of. And it is based, it's actually set a little bit earlier. It's in around 1815, 1812 in Europe. And it's based on, again, a real woman who lived, who sort of overlooked in society, but she was very much at the center of a group of artists and writers.
We'll look forward to hearing about that as well.
Yeah.
Friends, I want to see if anyone else has questions that were not asked. I think I got everything that was sent to me or shared with me, as well as my own. And you talked so beautifully at the beginning about memory and Judaism, and just the power of that. And when we think about, especially as we're approaching Hanukkah, I know many of us will pull out Hanukkot that have been in our families potentially for generations, but even if, whether it's the ones we use that our children used when they were little or ones that were passed down, there's something about the tangible that reminds us of those moments. You also mentioned, and I feel very similarly now that my youngest is in high school, but others out of the house, missing those earlier days and times, and missing people who are no longer with us. And I'm curious about that, not just in terms of this book, but in general, when you think about how we record our history as a people, how that has either inspired or influenced the way that you write. It's
really like the central part of my writing life, memory and understanding, because memory isn't just a story, it's really how your understanding of an event, and you've got your understanding of an event as it's happening, then recently after it's occurred, and then what it's like when you examine it 20 years later. And some of those things stay the same, but many of those, that perspective changes because you've lived a different life at that point. And, my favorite menorah is the one that my daughter actually made in preschool at the JCC up here. And it's like all got, it's just painted rainbow colors, and the candle holders are actually like the outside of a screw, like a lug nut, like. And
I have some of those.
We always probably have the same one. We have lots of different ones, and I put them all out, but that's my favorite one. And but I make an active point in my day-to-day life of memory can be so many things. And I think some people shy away from memory because it implies sorrow. And I think for me, it holds joy. And I think that if you allow yourself to feel the sorrow, on the other side of sorrow is appreciation. And that's where I try to get to. So while I'm lighting this and I'm missing those early days, and I truly allowed myself to grieve and mourn, I don't get to be with those little people anymore. They're now bigger people, and I'm thrilled to know them. But there is a mourning process there. but when I light those candles on what my daughter made, I'm able to sort of have all of those selves that are all together. It's her little girl self and her middle school self and her now college age self. And I have everybody all together. And I also have in that same room, like, I've got my grandparents are no longer with me, but they're like, I think about them every day. I'm grateful for them every day. And every once in a while, it's a sadness with gratitude, but much of the time it's just gratitude and joy and feeling like they are still with me, and telling stories about them to my kids, who will then tell stories maybe to their kids or to their friends, so that whether it's recipes or jokes or, my one grandmother had a very inappropriate sense of humor, and I carry that with me, and those are just terrific. And I love that my kids will say phrases, from people that they didn't get to know, or, they were actually close to my grandparents. And, so I feel like memory is not something to be scared of. It's really something to appreciate and love. And I'm thinking about memory in a very different way. My mom actually has Alzheimer's. She's quite young, but she has Alzheimer's. And I, I'm watching her memories become distorted or forgotten. And it's sort of, memory is really partly how we keep our personhood, and your memories are part of who you are. And so I just think about memory a lot.
It's so powerful. I mean, that's exactly why we have different items on the Seder table to elicit questions, so that we can tell the story in its fullness, not the same exact story every time, the same thread, but adding to it, because that is part of what we transmit. That's the Torah we hand from generation to generation. It's not just the words in the scroll, but it's the letters in between, and the stories that accompany it, and the commentaries of the centuries. It's so beautiful. We have a couple questions in the chat. One, would you be willing to share the name of the person you're researching for the next novel? And it's okay if you're not, but that was a question.
I'm going to hold off for now, because I think my publisher would like me to hold
Okay.
off.
Our interest is piqued, and you'll let us know. We'll
Yes.
be excited to see. And then we have from Joan Churchill, Edith Wharton's book suggests that New York wealthy society was quite snobbish about new money at the time. Given Isabella's own family's wealth and her education at a finishing school in Paris, it's hard to understand how different the Boston Brahmins were from the elite in New York City. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I think also if you read The Lioness of Boston, there's a dinner party scene early on that really sort of goes into the Boston Brahmin. I can, if you want, I can just share like one quick paragraph from that.
Sure.
Okay. So part of it is that, this group, the Brahmins, the Boston Brahmin, that term was only coined the same year that the book starts. That's Oliver Wendell Holmes, a physician and writer who coins that term, the Boston Brahmins. And it's all of the names that are on all the buildings, around here. And so I don't have to read the scene, but it's really, there's a Boston. New York was a little swishier. It was a little more, there was grandeur. There was the sort of, when you think the golden age, of New York, you're picturing Edith Wharton. Now, first of all, Edith Wharton's a little bit later. Edith Wharton was much younger than Isabella. They did overlap, and Edith Wharton makes one brief cameo in the novel. But the golden age of New York, it really is golden and gilt covered and whatever.
Gilded Age.
The Gilded Age, yes, exactly. So in Boston, this is how I describe it. So Isabella has arrived. She's at this dinner party that she doesn't want to be at. And she says, the room was grand in the understated Boston way. Upholstered fine furniture, lighting neither too bright nor too dim, nothing too showy, nothing that appeared recently acquired, for part of the custom of this realm was to present the self in one's house as always having been this way. I was the only new addition. And that is really the difference between Boston and New York. Boston, and it's still a little bit that way. Like if you've been to Boston or you've been to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, the way that wealth is displayed is not in new and shiny. It's in old tattered khakis and a beaten up Volvo that's very old. And why would you, have to display your wealth in such a new way? And so I think the two cities are just not similar in that way. And Boston, it's understated, it's academic, it's medical, it's research, it's Harvard. And sort of much more tied to London and cobblestones and old guard.
It's fascinating. I know some of you are aware we have this we have a monthly lecture series, and this coming weekend on Sunday we have a book called Morgenthau by Andrew Meyer. He was also part of the Jewish Book Council, but it is about New York at roughly the same time, and the origin story of the Morgenthau family in New York, but talks a lot about the Astors and Schiffs and others who were, part of that New York elite, and certainly about a different aspect that you alluded to briefly about Pizarro, but really about how the Jewish set within our crowd, how that all developed, and how Jews found their place in New York, which was a different experience than in Boston, that history.
Yes.
So
True.
well, really thank you, Emily, for fulfilling Doctora's words and really helping us feel, but also balancing that with the history as well, and giving us all a flavor. I foresee in the future perhaps a Women of Washington Hebrew, a sisterhood trip to Boston and to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I think that would be fantastic. So we might want to
it's a great field trip to take. I mean,
yeah, we might want to think about, we're starting to really do some planning for trips now that we are hopefully out of COVID. And I think that could be a fun, easy trip, perhaps, for us to take.
Definitely. And actually, it's sort of fun. You can do a Lioness of Boston walking tour, because there's all
with
of
you.
Oh, sure. I'll leave that. Where, you can see these buildings and statues and gardens that, are in the book, and they're just being created then. Frederick Law Olmsted had such an eye towards, the future. And it's great. I hope that you'll consider doing that.
Thank you. So I've planted the seed. We'll have to follow up with the powers that be within the sisterhood. And yes, I see in here, as we think ahead, on Sunday morning, we have Andrew Meyer will be presenting Morgenthau at 10:30 a.m. at Temple, and we look forward to seeing folks there. But Emily, we want to thank you for taking the time and for joining us today, and also thank you for your flexibility. I didn't mention this at the outset. We were supposed to meet with Emily at noon on November 14th, which ended up being the March for Israel, and we know that was important for us to be there and be present. And we are so grateful, Emily, to you for your flexibility and for making this work. And thank you to everyone who rearranged schedules to do this. It was certainly worthwhile. And I promise you, reading the book will be well worthwhile as well. So I hope that you'll make sure to do that as well.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me. Thank you to everybody for being here. And I do hope you'll check out the book and let me know. Oh, fun.
Anyway, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Everybody. Have a great evening, everyone.